The dust swirled through Jerusalem's narrow streets like whispered secrets, carrying with it the scent of burning incense and the weight of uncertainty. It was the 8th century before Christ, and the ancient world trembled on the edge of transformation. The Assyrian war machine rolled across nations like thunder across the sky, leaving behind only silence and ash. In the markets, merchants spoke in hushed tones of cities that had vanished overnight, of kings who had knelt before foreign gods, of empires that had crumbled like sand castles before the tide. But Jerusalem still stood. The Temple Mount rose like a beacon above the chaos, its stones worn smooth by centuries of prayers and sacrifices. The city's walls had weathered countless storms, and within them, life continued with the stubborn persistence that marks all human endeavor. Children played in the courtyards while their mothers ground grain and wove cloth. Priests performed their ancient rituals while scribes copied sacred texts by flickering lamplight. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, something stirred in the shadows. The people of Judah walked through their days carrying invisible burdens. They had witnessed the northern kingdom of Israel torn apart by Assyrian armies, had seen their brothers and sisters led away in chains, never to return. The survivors who fled south brought with them tales that froze the blood and haunted the dreams of those who heard them. How long before the same fate befell Jerusalem? How long before their own children would be scattered to the winds? King Uzziah had ruled for 52 years, bringing prosperity and strength to the kingdom. Under his reign, the walls had been rebuilt, the army strengthened, and trade routes secured. The people had grown comfortable in their success, perhaps too comfortable. They built larger houses and accumulated greater wealth, but their hearts had grown distant from the sacred fire that once burned bright in their ancestors' souls. The rituals continued. The sacrifices were offered, but something essential had been lost along the way. In the temple courts, corruption crept in like ivy on ancient stones. Priests who should have been shepherds of the people's souls instead pursued their own gain. Justice, once the cornerstone of their society, had become a commodity to be bought and sold. The wealthy oppressed the poor while the guardians of the law turned blind eyes to suffering. The very foundations upon which their civilization rested were cracking, yet few seemed to notice or care. The prophets of old had warned of such times, but their voices had faded to echoes in dusty scrolls. Where were the seers who could pierce the veil between heaven and earth? Where were those who could speak truth to power and call the people back to their sacred purpose? The silence from above felt heavier than the threat of foreign armies, more terrifying than the prospect of defeat in battle. Among the priestly families of Jerusalem lived a young man whose name would one day echo through the corridors of eternity. He walked the same streets as his neighbors, breathed the same dust-laden air, and felt the same uncertainty that gripped every heart in the city. But within him stirred something different, something he could not yet name or understand. It was like a seed buried deep in fertile soil, waiting for the right moment to break through the earth and reach toward the light. This young man had been raised in the traditions of his people, taught to read the ancient texts and understand the ways of worship. He knew the stories of Abraham's faith, of Moses leading the people through the wilderness, of David's psalms and Solomon's wisdom. Yet knowledge alone felt insufficient in the face of the darkness that seemed to be gathering on the horizon. He sensed that something momentous was approaching, though he could not say what form it might take. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a word that had not yet been spoken, a revelation that had not yet been given. In the markets, people bought and sold as they always had, but their conversations carried an undercurrent of anxiety. In the temple, the daily sacrifices continued, but the smoke that rose from the altar seemed to dissipate too quickly, as if the very heavens were distant and distracted. Change was coming. It moved like a storm front across the landscape of history. Invisible yet undeniable, the old certainties were cracking, the familiar patterns disrupted. What had once seemed permanent and unshakable now revealed itself to be as fragile as morning mist. The mighty Assyrian Empire appeared unstoppable, yet even empires were merely human constructs, subject to the same forces of creation and destruction that governed all earthly things. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city lay wrapped in shadows and only the temple guards kept watch, something stirred in the spiritual atmosphere. It was subtle at first, like the faintest breath of wind before a storm. Those sensitive to such things might have felt a tingling in the air, a sense that the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds was growing thin. But most remained unaware, lost in their daily concerns and earthly preoccupations. The young man who would soon become known to history walked through these pre-dawn streets, his sandals soft against the worn stones. He was drawn by something he could not explain to the temple precincts, where the sacred and the mundane intersected. There, in the growing light of morning, he would often stand in silent contemplation, watching the priests prepare for the day's rituals, observing the interplay of shadow and light on the ancient walls. He did not yet know that he stood at the threshold of destiny, that his life was about to be transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The comfortable certainties of his upbringing, the predictable rhythms of religious observance, the familiar boundaries of his world were all about to be shattered and remade. But for now, he was simply a young man in an ancient city, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers, searching for meaning in a world that seemed increasingly uncertain. The morning sun cast long shadows across the temple courtyard as Isaiah, son of Amoz, made his way through the familiar passages of his daily routine. At 25, he possessed the quiet intensity that often marks those destined for extraordinary purposes. Though he himself remained unaware of the significance that would one day attach to his name, his dark eyes held depths that suggested a soul perpetually wrestling with questions too large for easy answers. And his hands bore the ink stains of a man who spent long hours copying sacred texts and pondering their meanings. Isaiah had been born into privilege, his family connected to the royal court and the priestly hierarchy that governed Jerusalem's spiritual life. Yet privilege had not insulated him from doubt. If anything, his access to the inner workings of power had only deepened his sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the world around him. He had watched kings make decisions based on political expediency rather than divine guidance, had seen priests more concerned with their own comfort than the welfare of their people, had witnessed the wealthy grow richer while the poor grew more desperate. These observations weighed heavily on his mind as he performed his duties in the temple. Each morning he would arrive before dawn to assist with the preparation of sacrifices, to ensure that the sacred fires burned bright and clean, to maintain the ritual purity that was supposed to connect heaven and earth. But increasingly these actions felt hollow, like elaborate performances staged for an absent audience. Where was the divine presence that these rituals were meant to invoke? Where was the transformative power that should accompany genuine worship? The young priest struggled with questions that had no comfortable answers. If God truly dwelt among his people, why did injustice flourish in the very shadow of the temple? If the sacrificial system was meant to atone for sin and restore harmony between humanity and the divine, why did corruption and cruelty seem to increase rather than diminish? Was he performing empty gestures, or was there something he was failing to understand about the nature of sacred duty? These doubts tormented Isaiah in the quiet hours when his official responsibilities were complete. He would often climb to the highest accessible point of the temple complex, looking out over the city he loved and feeling overwhelmed by its spiritual poverty. The people went through the motions of religious observance, but their hearts seemed far from the God they claimed to serve. They offered sacrifices while oppressing the vulnerable, recited prayers while plotting against their neighbors, proclaim their faithfulness while pursuing their own selfish interests. The weight of this hypocrisy pressed down on Isaiah like a physical burden. He began to question not only the society around him, but his own role within it. Was he complicit in a system that had lost its way? Did his participation in rituals that seemed increasingly meaningless make him part of the problem rather than part of any solution? These thoughts haunted his dreams and shadowed his waking hours, creating a restlessness that no amount of religious activity could satisfy. His family noticed the change in him, the way he had grown quiet and withdrawn. His father Amaz tried to counsel him with the wisdom of experience, reminding him that doubt was a natural part of spiritual maturation. But Isaiah's questions went deeper than typical religious uncertainty. He was not merely wondering about specific doctrines or practices. He was questioning the very foundation of everything he had been taught to believe about the relationship between God and humanity. In the privacy of his own chamber, Isaiah would pore over the ancient scrolls, searching for answers that seemed always to elude his grasp. He read the accounts of Moses encountering the burning bush, of Abraham hearing the divine voice, of Jacob wrestling with the mysterious stranger through the night. These stories spoke of direct divine encounters, of moments when heaven touched earth with unmistakable clarity. But where were such encounters in his own time? Had God withdrawn from the world, leaving humanity to stumble forward in spiritual darkness? The political situation only intensified Isaiah's spiritual crisis. News arrived daily of Assyrian advances, of kingdoms falling before their seemingly unstoppable military machine. King Uzziah, who had provided stability and prosperity for so many years, was growing old and weak. The future appeared increasingly uncertain, and the people looked to their religious leaders for reassurance that Isaiah felt unqualified to provide. How could he offer comfort to others when his own faith felt so fragile? Yet beneath the doubt and questioning, something else stirred within Isaiah's heart. It was a hunger he could not fully name, a longing that went beyond mere intellectual curiosity. He yearned for authentic encounter with the divine, for some confirmation that all his seeking and questioning had meaning. This hunger drove him to spend longer and longer periods in prayer and meditation, often remaining in the temple long after the other priests had departed for their homes. During these solitary vigils, Isaiah would sometimes sense a presence that seemed to hover just beyond the edge of perception. It was nothing he could point to or describe with certainty, but it left him with the impression that he was being watched, evaluated, perhaps even prepared for something he could not yet understand. These moments filled him with both hope and terror, for he sensed that whatever was coming would demand everything of him. The young priest's internal struggle was intensified by his deep love for his people and his nation. He could see the spiritual decay eating away at the foundations of Judah like a hidden cancer, but he felt powerless to address it. His position gave him influence over ritual matters, but little voice in the larger issues of justice and social responsibility that seemed to be at the heart of the crisis. He was trapped between his desire to serve God authentically and his inability to see clearly how such service might be possible. As the days passed, Isaiah's restlessness grew more acute. He began to pray not just for guidance but for transformation, for some divine intervention that would either confirm his faith or release him from the burden of pretending to certainties he did not possess. This prayer, offered in desperation and sincerity, would soon be answered in ways he could never have imagined. The year King Uzziah died, the very air in Jerusalem seemed to thicken with unspoken dread. It was as if the city itself could sense that an era was ending, that the familiar rhythms of life were about to be disrupted by forces beyond human comprehension. The king had ruled for 52 years, longer than most people could remember, and his death felt like the snapping of an anchor chain that had held the ship of state steady through countless storms. Isaiah felt this shift more acutely than most. In the weeks leading up to the king's passing, he had experienced a growing sense of anticipation that he could neither explain nor dismiss. It was not anxiety about political succession or economic uncertainty, though these concerns certainly weighed on everyone's minds. Rather, it was something deeper, more primal, as if the very fabric of reality was being rewoven in patterns he could not yet perceive. The symptoms began subtly. During his morning prayers, Isaiah would find his attention drawn away from familiar words and rituals towards something hovering just beyond the edge of awareness. He would catch himself listening for sounds that were not there, straining to hear voices that spoke in languages older than human speech. These moments would pass quickly, leaving him wondering if he was succumbing to the same spiritual desperation that had driven other young priests to claim divine visions they had never truly received. But the experiences grew more intense and frequent. While copying sacred texts, Isaiah would sometimes feel as though the ancient words were alive, pulsing with meanings that transcended their literal content. The stories of divine encounters that had once seemed distant and mythological began to feel immediate and present. as if the boundary between past and present was dissolving. He would look up from his work to find the temple chamber filled with a quality of light that seemed to come from no earthly source, only to have it fade the moment he tried to focus on it directly. Sleep brought no relief from these strange visitations. Isaiah's dreams became vivid and symbolic, filled with imagery that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. He would see vast courts populated by beings of terrible beauty, hear choruses singing in harmonies that human voices could never produce, witness scenes of cosmic significance that his waking mind could not fully retain or comprehend. These nocturnal visions left him exhausted and disoriented, yet also strangely energized, as if he were being prepared for something momentous. The other priests noticed the change in him, though they interpreted it through the lens of their own limited experience. Some suggested that the stress of the king's illness was affecting his mental state, while others wondered if he was developing the kind of religious mania that sometimes struck young men who took their duties too seriously. A few of the older priests, those who had served through multiple generations of political upheaval, recognized something familiar in Isaiah's condition and watched him with a mixture of sympathy and apprehension. His family's concern deepened as Isaiah's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would disappear for hours at a time, returning with dust on his clothes and a distant look in his eyes that suggested he had traveled far beyond the physical boundaries of Jerusalem. When questioned about these absences, he would offer vague explanations about seeking solitude for prayer and meditation. But his answers satisfied no one, least of all himself. The truth was that Isaiah felt drawn to places where the presence he sensed seemed strongest. Sometimes this would be the innermost chambers of the temple, where the sacred artifacts and ancient rituals created an atmosphere charged with spiritual significance. Other times he would find himself walking the hills outside the city where the silence and isolation allowed him to listen more carefully to the whispers that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath his feet. During one such excursion, as the sun was setting behind the Mount of Olives and painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Isaiah experienced something that shook him to his core. He was sitting alone on a rocky outcropping, watching the lights begin to flicker in the windows of Jerusalem below, when suddenly the familiar landscape seemed to shimmer and transform. For just a moment he saw the city not as it was but as it might become, its walls gleaming with supernatural radiance, its streets filled with people whose faces bore an expression of joy and reverence he had never witnessed in his waking life. The vision lasted only seconds, but its impact was profound and lasting. Isaiah understood with a certainty that bypassed rational thought that he had been granted a glimpse of something real and significant. This was not wishful thinking or religious fantasy. It was revelation, a pulling back of the veil that normally concealed deeper realities from human perception. Yet even as he tried to process what he had seen, the details began to fade like morning mist, leaving him with only the memory of overwhelming beauty and the conviction that his life was about to change in ways he could not imagine. Word of King Uzziah's final illness spread through the city like ripples in a disturbed pool. The king had been stricken with leprosy years earlier, as divine punishment for his presumption in entering the temple to burn incense, a privilege reserved for priests alone. Since then he had lived in isolation while his son Jotham governed in his name. Now even this shadow existence was drawing to a close, and with it an epoch in the history of Judah. Isaiah found himself drawn repeatedly to the temple during these final days, not out of official duty but by a compulsion he could not resist. The building itself seemed different, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end and filled him with alternating waves of excitement and terror. The familiar chambers and corridors had taken on an otherworldly quality, as if they were becoming transparent to reveal realities normally hidden from human sight. The other priests attributed these changes to their own emotional response to the king's approaching death. But Isaiah knew that something far more significant was occurring. The whispers he had been hearing were growing louder and more distinct, though he still could not make out their specific content. Sometimes he would catch fragments that sounded like his own name being called, but when he turned to look, he would find himself alone in passages that seemed to echo with invisible presences. On the night of the king's death, Isaiah was awakened by what sounded like distant thunder, though the sky was clear and filled with stars. He rose from his bed and made his way to his window, looking out over the sleeping city that would wake to find itself in a new era. As he stood there in the darkness, he felt a presence behind him so tangible that he spun around, expecting to find an intruder in his chamber. But there was no one there. Only a lingering sense that he had been touched by something vast and purposeful. The funeral preparations that followed were elaborate and solemn, befitting a king who had ruled for more than half a century. Isaiah participated in the ritual mourning and the ceremonial observances, but his attention was divided between his official duties and the growing awareness that these events were merely the visible surface of deeper transformations occurring in realms beyond ordinary perception. As the king's body was prepared for burial and the elaborate funeral procession organized, Isaiah felt himself being drawn toward a confrontation with mysteries that would either destroy him or transform him beyond recognition. The whispers that had been haunting him for weeks were building toward some kind of crescendo, and he sensed that very soon he would either understand their meaning or be overwhelmed by forces too powerful for human comprehension. The day of the funeral dawned gray and overcast, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the passing of an age. As Isaiah took his place among the priests and officials who would escort the king's body to its final resting place, he felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a mantle he had not asked to wear. Something was ending, and something else was about to begin, and he stood at the threshold between them, waiting for a summons he could no longer ignore. The temple chamber had never felt so vast or so intimate at the same time. Isaiah stood alone in the sacred space where he had performed countless rituals, where the familiar had suddenly become foreign, where the boundary between earth and heaven had grown thin as gossamer. The morning light filtered through ancient windows, but it seemed to carry qualities that ordinary sunlight had never possessed, as if it were being refracted through dimensions of reality he had never suspected existed. What happened next defied every category of human experience Isaiah had ever known. Later, when he would try to describe it to others, he would struggle with the inadequacy of language, the impossibility of translating divine encounter into merely human words. How do you describe colors that have no name, sounds that bypass the ears to resonate directly in the soul? Presences that are more real than physical matter, yet invisible to ordinary sight. The air itself began to shimmer and thicken, as if reality were becoming more concentrated, more essential. Isaiah felt his knees grow weak, not from physical exhaustion, but from the overwhelming sense that he was in the presence of something infinitely greater than himself. His breathing became shallow and rapid as the familiar dimensions of the chamber seemed to expand beyond all earthly limitations. The walls did not disappear, but somehow they also contained vastness beyond measurement, and then he saw the throne. It rose before him like a mountain of crystallized light, yet it was all so intimate and immediate. Close enough to touch, yet separated by chasms of holiness that made approach unthinkable. Upon it sat a figure of such overwhelming majesty that Isaiah's mind could not fully process what his eyes were seeing. This was not the kind of seeing that happens when light reflects off surfaces and enters the pupil. This was seeing with faculties he had not known he possessed, perception that engaged his entire being rather than merely his physical senses. The figure on the throne emanated presence in the way the sun emanates light, not as an action or effort, but as an expression of essential nature. Isaiah understood without being told that he was looking upon the source and center of all existence, the foundation upon which the cosmos rested, the ultimate reality from which all other realities derived their being. The recognition did not come through reasoning or deduction, but through direct, undeniable knowing that bypassed every filter of doubt or analysis. Around the throne, beings moved with purpose and reverence that spoke of eons of devoted service. They were beautiful beyond human imagination, yet terrible in their otherness, creatures whose very existence declared the infinite creativity and power of the one they served. Some had faces like burning coals, others features that shifted like flame or flowing water. They moved through dimensions that intersected with the physical world yet transcended its limitations, their presence filling the chamber with harmonies that made earthly music sound like the scratching of children's toys. Their voices rose in continuous proclamation, words that seemed to shake the foundations of the temple while simultaneously penetrating to the deepest recesses of Isaiah's heart. Holy, 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 they sang, and each repetition added new layers of meaning, new depths of understanding about the nature of absolute purity and perfect righteousness. This was not merely a description, but a declaration of fundamental reality, a statement about the very fabric of existence itself. Isaiah felt the sound wash over him and through him, and with it came a devastating awareness of his own condition. In the light of such absolute holiness, every compromise he had ever made, every selfish thought he had entertained, every moment of moral cowardice or spiritual laziness was exposed with surgical precision. He saw himself as he truly was, not through the flattering lens of self-justification, but in the harsh clarity of divine truth. The recognition was unbearable. He fell to the ground, his face pressed against the cold stone floor, overwhelmed by shame and terror. How could someone so flawed, so contaminated by sin and selfishness, survive in the presence of such perfect purity? He felt as though he were being consumed by fire. Not the fire of destruction, but the fire of absolute truth that burned away every pretense and left only naked reality. Every defense he had ever constructed, every excuse he had ever offered, every way he had ever found to feel good about himself crumbled under the weight of divine holiness. "Woe is me," he cried, the words torn from the depths of his being. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips." The confession poured out of him like poison being drained from an infected wound. He saw not only his own corruption, but the collective spiritual disease that had infected his entire society. The religious observances, the ritual sacrifices, the proclamations of faith, all of it was tainted by the same fundamental alienation from divine holiness that had corrupted his own heart. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him completely, something else was happening. One of the beings around the throne approached him, moving with graceful purpose. In its hand was a glowing coal taken from the altar, a fragment of the fire that burns at the center of all reality. Isaiah watched in terror and wonder as the creature drew near, understanding instinctively that this encounter would either destroy him completely or transform him in ways he could not imagine. The coal touched his lips, and the sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was burning and cooling at the same time, painful yet healing, devastating yet restorative. He felt the fire penetrating not just his physical being, but the deepest recesses of his soul, seeking out every trace of corruption and consuming it in flames that purified rather than destroyed. The pain was intense but strangely welcome, like the agony of surgical intervention that removes diseased tissue to make healing possible. "Your guilt is taken away," the voice declared, words that carried the authority of absolute truth. "Your sin is atoned for." Isaiah felt the burden he had carried all his life, the weight of moral failure and spiritual inadequacy that had haunted his every moment, suddenly lift from his shoulders. It was not that his failures were excused or overlooked, but that they were actually genuinely removed, burned away by the fire of divine grace until nothing remained but restored purity. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Where moments before he had been crushed by the awareness of his own unworthiness, now he felt clean and whole in a way he had never experienced. It was not the false confidence of self-deception or the temporary relief of forgiveness, but the deep, abiding peace of someone whose fundamental relationship with reality had been restored to its proper order. As he lay there on the temple floor, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred, Isaiah became aware that something more was required of him. The encounter was not ending, but moving into a new phase. He had been brought into this presence not merely for his own transformation, but for purposes that extended far beyond his personal experience. The divine holiness that had first terrified him was now calling him to participate in its purposes for the world. From the throne came a voice that seemed to encompass all voices, speaking with the authority that had called the cosmos into existence. "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation, seeking someone willing to carry the divine message into a world that desperately needed to hear it yet would resist with every fiber of its being. Isaiah understood that he was being offered a choice that would determine the entire trajectory of his remaining life. He could remain silent, allow this moment to pass, and return to the familiar routines of religious observance. Or he could step forward into a role that would demand everything of him, that would cost him comfort, safety, and the approval of those around him. The choice was his. But he knew that having seen what he had seen, having been transformed as he had been transformed, there was really only one answer he could give. "Here am I," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was accepting. "Send me." The silence that followed Isaiah's acceptance stretched like a chasm between worlds. In that suspended moment, he felt the weight of eternity pressing down upon his shoulders, each second expanding to contain lifetimes of consequence. The throne room that had blazed with supernatural light now seemed to pulse with a different energy, one that spoke not of comfort but of terrible purpose. He had offered himself freely, but now came the revelation of what that offering would cost. The voice from the throne, when it came again, carried tones that made Isaiah's newly purified heart tremble with recognition of what lay ahead. These were not the gentle words of reassurance he might have hoped for, not the promise of easy victories or grateful audiences. Instead, they fell upon him like stones cast into still water, each one creating ripples that would spread through his entire existence. "Go and tell this people," came the divine command. And already Isaiah could sense the bitter irony embedded in those simple words. Not my people or your people, but this people, spoken with a distance that suggested estrangement rather than intimacy. The very phrasing carried within it the seeds of the heartbreak that would define his ministry. But the full weight of his calling had yet to be revealed. What came next shattered every expectation he might have harbored about the nature of prophetic service. Be ever hearing, but never understanding. Be ever seeing, but never perceiving. The words struck him like physical blows, each phrase adding another layer to the impossibility of what he was being asked to do. Isaiah felt his mind reeling as the implications began to unfold. He was being sent not to convert, but to confirm. Not to open eyes, but to seal them shut. Not to bring healing, but to deepen the wound. The paradox was almost unbearable. He who had just experienced the most profound spiritual awakening of his life was now tasked with ensuring that others would remain spiritually blind. "Make the heart of this people dull," the voice continued relentlessly, "and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return and be healed." Each word fell upon Isaiah's consciousness like a weight, building toward a burden he was not sure any human soul could bear. The young prophet struggled to comprehend the divine logic behind such a commission. Why would the God who had just revealed himself in such magnificent holiness now command his messenger to obscure rather than illuminate that same holiness? Why would perfect love choose to harden hearts rather than soften them? The questions burned within him, but even as they formed, he sensed that they touched upon mysteries too deep for immediate understanding. Yet beneath the surface confusion, Isaiah began to glimpse something of the terrible wisdom at work. The people had already chosen their path, had already turned their faces away from the light that sought to guide them. His words would not create their blindness. They would merely expose it, confirm it, make it undeniable. Sometimes the most merciful thing love can do is to allow the consequences of rejection to become fully visible, to let people see clearly where their chosen path leads. The weight of this calling pressed down upon him like a mountain. To speak words of truth knowing they would not be received. To offer light knowing it would be rejected. To love a people who would despise him for loving them. To serve God faithfully while appearing to all the world as a failure, a voice crying in the wilderness with no one listening, no one responding, no one changed. How long, O Lord? The question tore itself from Isaiah's lips before he could consider whether it was appropriate to question divine purpose. The anguish behind it was genuine and immediate. How long would he be required to preach to deaf ears? How long would he watch his people stumble toward destruction while his warnings fell on hardened hearts? The answer came without mercy or softening. Until the cities lie deserted and the fields ruined and ravaged, until the ruined and without inhabitant, until the houses are left has sent everyone far away and the land is utterly forsaken. The timeline stretched ahead of him like an endless desert, offering no oasis of success, no moment of vindication, no relief from the burden of speaking truth to those determined not to hear it. Isaiah felt something breaking inside him, not his resolve, but his illusions about what faithful service would look like. He had imagined, perhaps, that divine calling would bring with it divine blessing in forms the world could recognize. Success, influence, transformation of hearts and minds. Instead, he was being offered the crown of thorns that belongs to those who speak truth in times when truth is unwelcome. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, another truth began to emerge from the darkness of his commission. There would be a remnant. Even in the midst of widespread spiritual desolation, something would remain. As the terebinth and oak leave stumps when they are cut down, so the holy seed will be the stump in the land. Not everyone would remain blind forever. Not every heart would stay hardened permanently. His ministry of apparent failure would, in ways he could not yet see, prepare the soil for future harvest. This promise of a remnant became the thread of hope he would cling to through the dark years ahead. When kings mocked him and priests threatened him, when friends abandoned him and enemies pursued him, he would remember that his words were not falling on completely barren ground. Somewhere, somehow, the seeds he scattered would find fertile soil and take root in hearts prepared by suffering to receive what prosperity had made them too proud to accept. The divine presence began to withdraw. Not suddenly, but gradually, like the slow fading of light at sunset. Isaiah felt himself being returned to ordinary time and space, though nothing about him or his circumstances would ever be ordinary again. The temple chamber resumed its familiar proportions, but he who stood within it had been fundamentally altered. He was no longer simply a priest performing ritual duties. He was a prophet carrying an impossible burden. As he made his way from the temple into the streets of Jerusalem, Isaiah saw everything with new eyes. The merchants haggling in the marketplace, the children playing in the courtyards, the priests hurrying about their duties, the nobles discussing affairs of state, all of them moved through their daily lives unaware that judgment had been pronounced, that their spiritual condition had been diagnosed as terminal, that the words which might have healed them would now serve only to confirm their disease. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. He loved these people, his people, with a love made more intense by his recent encounter with divine holiness. Yet that same encounter had revealed to him their true condition and his own powerlessness to change it through any ordinary means. He would speak because he had been commanded to speak, but he would do so knowing that his words would accomplish the opposite of what every natural instinct told him they should accomplish. In the days that followed, Isaiah began to understand something of what it meant to participate in divine purposes that transcended human understanding. His calling was not to be successful in the way the world measured success. It was to be faithful in the way heaven measured faithfulness. The fruit of his labor would be visible not in his own lifetime, but in God's timing, not in immediate transformation, but in ultimate vindication. This realization brought with it a strange kind of peace. He was not responsible for results, only for obedience. He was not called to change hearts, only to speak truth. The outcomes belonged to God. The faithfulness belonged to Him. In accepting this division of labor between the human and the divine, Isaiah found the strength to begin a ministry that would defy every human expectation while fulfilling every divine purpose. The impossible mission had become possible not through any change in its objective difficulty, but through a fundamental shift in how success would be measured. Isaiah would learn to find victory in apparent defeat, hope in seeming hopelessness, and the deepest satisfaction of his life in doing work that appeared to accomplish nothing while actually accomplishing everything. The transformation within Isaiah was complete, but the world around him remained unchanged, and it was in this gap between inner revelation and outer reality that his true testing began. Jerusalem continued its ancient rhythms. Merchants still called their wares in the marketplace. Priests still performed their rituals in the temple, and kings still made decisions based on political expedience rather than divine guidance. Into this familiar world stepped a man carrying an impossible message, and the collision was immediate and devastating. Isaiah's first public proclamation came not through careful planning, but through compulsion that felt like fire in his bones. Standing in the temple courtyard where pilgrims gathered from across the kingdom, he raised his voice with words that cut through the comfortable murmur of religious routine like a sword through silk. Hear, O heavens, listen, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The immediate response was not the thoughtful consideration he might have hoped for, nor even the angry rejection he had been warned to expect. It was something far more devastating: indifference. People paused in their conversations, glanced in his direction with mild curiosity, then resumed their activities as if he had merely commented on the weather. The words that had burned within him like molten gold fell upon ears that received them as casually as they might receive gossip from a neighbor. But Isaiah pressed on, driven by the divine commission that gave him no choice but to speak truth regardless of its reception. Your whole head is injured, your whole heart afflicted. From the sole of your foot to the top of your head there is no soundness, only wounds and welts and open sores, not cleansed or bandaged or soothed with oil. The imagery was stark, unflinching, designed to penetrate the comfortable self-deceptions that allowed people to ignore their spiritual condition. This time the response was more engaged, but not in the way Isaiah had hoped. Religious leaders began to frown and shake their heads, muttering among themselves about young priests who spoke beyond their station. Merchants complained that such negative talk was bad for business, discouraging pilgrims and creating an atmosphere of gloom where celebration should reign. Even ordinary citizens seemed offended by the suggestion that their comfortable lives were built on spiritual foundations that were crumbling beneath their feet. The pattern established in those first days would repeat itself countless times over the years that followed. Isaiah would speak with the authority of one who had stood in the presence of divine holiness. But his audience would hear only the voice of a troublemaker, a pessimist, a man whose dark vision threatened their peace of mind. The more urgently he proclaimed his message, the more determinedly they rejected it, as if his very passion proved his unreliability. King Jotham, who had ruled in his father's shadow during Uzziah's illness and now wore the crown in his own right, summoned Isaiah to court after reports reached the palace of the young prophet's disturbing proclamations. The meeting took place in a chamber decorated with the spoils of military victories and diplomatic successes, tangible evidence of Judah's prosperity and power. Against this backdrop of achievement, Isaiah's warning seemed not just unwelcome but absurd. These are troubling times, the king acknowledged with the practiced diplomacy of one accustomed to managing difficult conversations. The people need encouragement, not condemnation. They need hope, not despair. Perhaps you could adjust your message to be more constructive? The suggestion was offered with the kind of reasonable tone that made dissent seem churlish, but Isaiah recognized it as a fundamental misunderstanding of his role, respectful firmness. "I speak, Your Majesty," Isaiah replied, "with only what I have been given to speak. The message is not mine to adjust." He went on to explain as gently as he could that true hope could only be built on true foundations, that healing could only begin with honest diagnosis, that the comfort the king sought to provide was the comfort of a physician who gave patients pleasant lies instead of bitter medicine. The king's response was predictable. If Isaiah could not be reasoned with, perhaps he could be marginalized. Word went out through official channels that the young priest was unstable, possibly suffering from the kind of religious mania that sometimes affected those who spent too much time in solitary prayer. His access to the temple was restricted. His family was encouraged to keep him under closer supervision, and influential citizens were advised to pay no attention to his increasingly desperate warnings. This official disapproval had the effect of isolating Isaiah not just from the centers of power but from the ordinary social networks that sustained daily life in Jerusalem. Friends became distant, relatives grew embarrassed by association, and even fellow priests began to treat him with the kind of careful politeness reserved for those who might be dangerous if provoked. The loneliness was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that it was only beginning. Yet even as human support fell away, Isaiah discovered resources within himself that he had not known existed. The divine encounter that had commissioned him had also equipped him with a kind of inner strength that did not depend on external validation. When people rejected his words, he remembered whose words they were. When they questioned his sanity, he recalled the throne room vision that had shown him reality beyond the reach of merely human perception. When they accused him of bringing despair, he held fast to the promise of a remnant that would ultimately vindicate both his message and his mission. The resistance to Isaiah's ministry took many forms, some subtle and others brutally direct. Religious authorities developed theological arguments to explain why his prophecies should not be taken seriously. Political leaders spread rumors about his mental state and his motives. Economic interests complained that his negative predictions were becoming self-fulfilling prophecies that damaged trade and discouraged investment. Even ordinary citizens found ways to dismiss or deflect messages that challenged their comfortable assumptions about their relationship with the divine. Perhaps most painfully, Isaiah began to see his own words fulfill themselves in ways that brought him no satisfaction. The spiritual blindness he had been warned about became increasingly evident as people developed an almost supernatural ability to misunderstand or ignore the clearest warnings. They would interpret his calls for justice as attacks on prosperity, his warnings of judgment as expressions of personal bitterness, his promises of eventual restoration as empty comfort offered by someone who had caused the very problems he claimed to solve. The psychological toll of this sustained resistance was enormous. Isaiah found himself caught between the divine compulsion to speak and the human longing to be heard, to be understood, to see some fruit from his labor. There were nights when he lay awake wrestling with doubt, not about the reality of his calling, but about his ability to fulfill it. There were days when the weight of rejection felt so heavy that he wondered if he had somehow misunderstood his commission, if he was supposed to find a different way to serve the divine purposes he had been shown. But each time despair threatened to overwhelm him, Isaiah would remember the coal that had touched his lips, the voice that had called him, the transformation that had made him capable of bearing this burden. He would recall that he had not chosen this path for its rewards, but for its rightness, not for its popularity, but for its truth. And slowly, gradually, he began to understand that the resistance he faced was not an obstacle to his ministry, but an integral part of it. The age of resistance was teaching him lessons that no amount of success could have provided. He was learning to measure faithfulness by divine standards rather than human ones, to find strength in divine approval rather than popular acclaim, to trust in divine timing rather than immediate results. Most importantly, he was discovering that love sometimes requires the willingness to be misunderstood, that truth sometimes demands the courage to stand alone, and that hope sometimes grows strongest in the soil of apparent hopelessness. As the years passed and the resistance to his message hardened into a kind of cultural institution, Isaiah began to see that he was not really fighting against his people, but fighting for them. Their rejection of his words was itself a symptom of the spiritual disease he had been sent to diagnose. Their inability to hear was evidence of their need for healing. Their resistance to change was proof of their bondage to forces they did not understand and could not overcome through their own efforts. This realization transformed his ministry from a battle to be won into a vigil to be maintained, from a problem to be solved into a mystery to be honored. He would continue to speak because speaking was his calling, but he would no longer expect his words to accomplish what only divine grace could accomplish. He would continue to love his people, but he would love them with the kind of patient, persistent love that does not depend on being loved in return. The age of resistance was far from over. But Isaiah had learned to live within it with a kind of fierce joy that came from knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do, regardless of how the world judged his effectiveness. In accepting the impossibility of his mission, he had discovered the secret of making it possible. The years had carved lines into Isaiah's face like a river cutting through stone, each mark a testament to words spoken into silence, to truths offered to those who preferred comfortable lies. His beard had grown silver at the edges, and his eyes held depths that spoke of visions both terrible and beautiful, of knowledge that came at a price few were willing to pay. The young priest who had once questioned his calling in the quiet hours before dawn had been transformed into something both more and less than human, a vessel carrying messages that burned within him like stars in the darkness. The resistance he had encountered in the early years of his ministry had evolved into something more sophisticated and complete. Where once people had argued with his words or dismissed them outright, now they simply failed to hear them at all. It was as if his voice had been shifted to a frequency beyond human perception, as if the spiritual deafness he had been warned about had become so complete that his most urgent proclamations fell on ears that processed them as meaningless sound. This development might have discouraged a man whose calling was based on earthly measures of success. But Isaiah had long since learned to gauge his faithfulness by different standards. The divine commission that had shaped his life made no promises about receptive audiences or transformed hearts. It spoke only of obedience, of speaking what must be spoken regardless of who chose to listen. In this strange mathematics of spiritual service, apparent failure had become the truest measure of authentic ministry. Yet even as his public proclamations met with increasing indifference, Isaiah's inner life grew richer and more complex. The throne room vision that had initiated his calling proved to be not a single event, but the beginning of an ongoing relationship with realms beyond ordinary perception. In the quiet hours when Jerusalem slept, and the weight of his mission pressed most heavily upon his spirit, he would find himself drawn into experiences that expanded his understanding of both divine purpose and human destiny. These subsequent visions came not with the overwhelming intensity of his first encounter, but with a gentleness that spoke of relationship rather than mere revelation. Sometimes he would find himself transported in spirit to places that existed beyond the boundaries of physical geography. standing in cosmic councils where the fate of nations was discussed with the calm deliberation of gardeners planning the seasons. Other times he would see deep into the hearts of his own people, witnessing the spiritual battles being fought behind facades of religious observance and social respectability. One such vision came to him on a night when the political situation had grown particularly desperate. Assyrian armies were moving closer to Judah's borders, and King Ahaz, who had succeeded his father Jotham, was considering alliances that would compromise the kingdom's spiritual integrity for the sake of military security. Uzziah had spent the day in fruitless attempts to counsel the king toward trust in divine protection rather than human schemes, and he returned to his home exhausted by the futility of his efforts. As he knelt in prayer, seeking strength to continue a ministry that seemed to accomplish nothing, the familiar shimmer began at the edges of his vision. The walls of his chamber grew transparent, revealing landscapes of the spirit that stretched beyond the horizon of earthly sight. He found himself standing in a vast plain where two great armies faced each other across a field that sparkled with supernatural light. On one side stood forces of darkness that defied description, beings whose very existence seemed to drain light and hope from the air around them. They moved with the coordinated purpose of creatures who had spent eons perfecting the art of destruction, and their weapons were forged from despair itself. Yet for all their terrible power they remained motionless, held in check by something they could not overcome through force. On the other side stood an army of light that was smaller in number but infinitely greater in authority. These beings radiated the same holiness Uzziah had encountered in the throne room, and their presence transformed the very air around them into something that sustained and strengthened rather than merely filled space. They too waited, but their stillness spoke of patience rather than paralysis, of timing rather than hesitation. Between the two armies in the center of the field stood a figure that drew Isaiah's attention with magnetic intensity. This was neither warrior nor commander, neither priest nor king, yet somehow embodied all these roles and more. The figure was human in form, yet divine in essence. Familiar yet mysterious, present yet eternal. Around this central being, the entire cosmic conflict seemed to pivot, as if all of history was moving toward a moment when this figure would act and everything would change. Uzziah understood without being told that he was witnessing something that had not yet occurred in earthly time, but was already accomplished in the realm of divine purpose. The battle he saw was not fought with swords and spears, but with truth and lies, with love and hatred, with hope and despair. The outcome was certain, but the cost would be enormous, paid not by the armies of light, but by the solitary figure who stood between them. As he watched, transfixed by the magnitude of what was unfolding before his spiritual eyes, Uzziah began to understand something of his own role in this cosmic drama. His words, which seemed to accomplish so little in the immediate present, were actually part of a vast preparation, laying groundwork for events that would unfold in their proper season. The apparent futility of his ministry was not evidence of failure, but proof that he was serving purposes larger than any single generation could comprehend. The vision shifted, and Uzziah found himself standing in a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were words and the casualties were souls. He saw himself as others saw him, a lone figure crying out warnings that no one heeded, proclaiming truths that no one wanted to hear. But now he also saw the invisible impact of his words, how they fell like seeds into hearts that appeared barren but were actually being prepared for future harvest. Some of those seeds would lie dormant for decades before sprouting. Others would take root immediately but remain hidden, growing in the secret places of conscience where no human eye could see their progress. Still others would be carried by those who heard them to distant places and future generations, where they would finally find the conditions necessary for their full flowering. Nothing he spoke was wasted, though much of its fruit would not be visible until long after his own voice had fallen silent. This revelation brought with it both comfort and burden. Comfort because it assured him that his apparent failures were actually successes measured by standards he could not yet fully understand. Burden because it showed him that his calling extended far beyond his own lifetime, that he was responsible not just for his own generation but for those yet to come. The weight of such responsibility might have crushed a man who carried it alone, but Isaiah had learned to share his burdens with the divine presence that had called him to this work. Another vision came during a time of personal loss, when death had claimed someone dear to him, and grief threatened to overwhelm his capacity to continue his prophetic ministry. In his sorrow, he had begun to question whether the cost of obedience was too high, whether the divine demands placed upon him exceeded what any human soul should be asked to bear. It was then that he was granted a glimpse into the heart of suffering itself, and what he saw there transformed his understanding of both pain and purpose. He found himself in a place that was neither light nor dark, but something beyond such simple categories, where the very air seemed to pulse with emotion too deep for words. Here he encountered the source of all compassion, the wellspring from which divine love flowed toward a wounded world. What he discovered was that the heart of God was not untouchable by human suffering, but was instead the place where all human suffering was gathered, held, and ultimately transformed. In the deepest hour of his ministry, when the weight of years had settled upon Isaiah's shoulders like dust from ancient ruins, the most profound vision of his life began to unfold. It came not with the overwhelming majesty of his first encounter in the temple, nor with the cosmic scope of his battlefield revelations, but with the quiet intensity of truth finally ready to be fully revealed. The prophet, now weathered by decades of speaking to deaf ears and witnessing the slow decay of everything he held dear, found himself standing at the threshold of understanding that would illuminate not just his own calling, but the entire trajectory of human history. The vision began in silence, in that peculiar quality of quiet that precedes the most significant revelations. Isaiah felt himself drawn away from the familiar confines of his earthly existence into a space that transcended both time and geography. Here, in this realm beyond ordinary perception, he witnessed scenes that would burn themselves into his consciousness with such clarity that centuries later, every detail would remain as vivid as the moment they were first revealed. He saw a young woman, her face radiant with a mixture of wonder and terror, receiving news that would shatter every assumption about how divine purposes unfold in human history. The messenger who brought this news was not of earthly origin, yet spoke with gentle authority that transformed fear into faith, confusion into acceptance. "Behold," the voice declared, "a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." The words carried within them the weight of eternity. The promise that the gap between heaven and earth would finally be bridged in the most unexpected way imaginable. Isaiah watched as this impossible prophecy took root not in the palaces of kings or the chambers of priests, but in the heart of a young woman whose only qualification was her willingness to say yes to mysteries she could not fully comprehend. The scene shifted, and he saw the child born not in splendor but in the humblest of circumstances, yet carrying within his small frame the fullness of divine nature united with perfect humanity. This was the figure he had glimpsed in his cosmic visions, the one around whom all of history pivoted, but now revealed in his most vulnerable and approachable form. The revelation unfolded like a scroll being slowly opened, each scene building upon the last to create a narrative of redemption that defied every human expectation about how salvation might come. Isaiah saw the child grow into a man who would speak with authority yet serve with humility, who would claim divine prerogatives yet empty himself for the sake of others. This was the wonderful counselor who would govern not through force but through love, the mighty God who would demonstrate power through self-sacrifice, the Prince of Peace who would establish his kingdom not by conquering enemies but by transforming hearts. But the vision did not stop with scenes of ministry and teaching, with moments of healing and hope. It pressed forward into darker territory, showing Isaiah the cost that would be required for this ultimate revelation of divine love. He saw the figure he had come to recognize as the promised Messiah facing rejection from the very people he had come to save, experiencing the kind of spiritual isolation that Isaiah himself knew all too well. The parallel was unmistakable and deeply personal, as if his own decades of prophetic ministry had been preparing him to understand this greater rejection, this more complete abandonment. The scenes that followed were almost too painful to witness, even in visionary form. Isaiah saw the suffering servant of his earlier prophecies revealed in heartbreaking detail, watched as divine love was met with human cruelty, as perfect innocence was subjected to the kind of injustice that had plagued the world since the first acts of rebellion against divine order. Yet even in the midst of this cosmic tragedy, Isaiah began to perceive the deeper purpose at work, the way in which apparent defeat was actually the mechanism of ultimate victory. He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, Isaiah found himself saying, the words flowing from his lips as if they had been waiting within him for this moment of complete understanding. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed. The familiar phrases took on new meaning as he watched their fulfillment unfold before his spiritual eyes, each word carrying weight that no amount of previous revelation had fully conveyed. The vision showed him how every form of human alienation from the divine would be addressed through this ultimate sacrifice. The pride that had led his people to reject their calling, the selfishness that had corrupted their worship, The spiritual blindness that had made them deaf to prophetic warnings, all of it was being taken upon shoulders strong enough to bear the weight of universal human failure. This was not merely punishment being transferred from the guilty to the innocent, but the actual transformation of guilt itself, the alchemical process by which divine love converted human failure into the raw material of redemption. Yet the vision did not end with death, even sacrificial death. Isaiah watched in amazement as the apparent finality of the grave was revealed to be merely a pause in a larger symphony, a moment of silence before the triumphant conclusion. He saw the tomb that could not hold its occupant, witnessed the resurrection that validated every impossible promise, observed the transformation of defeat into victory that would echo through all subsequent history. This was the vindication that had been promised to him in his own calling, the ultimate proof that divine purposes could not be thwarted by human resistance or earthly opposition. The scope of the vision expanded beyond individual redemption to encompass the transformation of entire civilizations. Isaiah saw how the message of the suffering servant would spread beyond the boundaries of his own people to reach nations that had never heard of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He watched as barriers of race and culture and geography were dissolved by the power of sacrificial love, as the promise to Abraham that all families of the earth would be blessed found its ultimate fulfillment in ways the patriarch could never have imagined. The prophet saw temples destroyed and rebuilt, empires rising and falling. Yet through it all, the message of divine love expressed through human suffering continued to spread and take root in hearts prepared by their own encounters with pain and loss. He understood that his own ministry of apparent failure had been part of this preparation, that his words, which seemed to accomplish nothing, had actually been laying groundwork for a harvest that would extend far beyond anything he could have hoped to see in his own lifetime. As the vision reached its crescendo, Isaiah found himself standing once again in the throne room where his calling had begun. But now he saw it with eyes that had been educated by decades of faithful service and supernatural revelation. The holiness that had once terrified him now filled him with profound peace, not because it had become less pure or demanding, but because he now understood how that purity could coexist with infinite mercy. The sacrifice he had witnessed in his vision had bridged the gap between divine perfection and human imperfection, making it possible for creatures like himself to stand in the presence of absolute holiness without being consumed. The voice that had commissioned him so many years ago spoke once more, but now with tones of completion rather than commissioning. "Well done, faithful servant," it said, and Isaiah understood that his long vigil was drawing to a close. He had been given not just glimpses of future events, but insight into their ultimate meaning. Not just prophecies to proclaim, but understanding of their cosmic significance. The impossible mission that had defined his life was revealed to have been possible all along. Not because of his own strength or wisdom, but because it had been part of a plan so vast and intricate that even apparent failures served essential purposes. The vision began to fade, but its impact would remain with Isaiah for the rest of his days. He had seen the end from the beginning, witnessed the resolution of every conflict, understood how every thread of suffering and hope would be woven together into a tapestry of redemption too beautiful for human imagination to conceive. His words, which had seemed to fall on deaf ears, would find their ultimate fulfillment in the life and death and resurrection of the one he had been privileged to glimpse in prophetic vision. The age of resistance would give way to an age of reception. The time of blindness would be followed by a time of sight, and the long night of waiting would finally dawn into the morning of fulfillment. The final years of Isaiah's earthly ministry passed like shadows lengthening at sunset, each day bringing him closer to the moment when his voice would join the chorus of prophetic witnesses who had spoken their pieces and passed into the realm of memory and influence. Yet even as his physical strength waned, the power of his words seemed to grow, as if the very act of faithful perseverance had imbued them with a quality that transcended their original historical context. The young priest who had once questioned his calling in the darkness before dawn had become something more than a prophet. He had become a bridge between his own troubled age and future generations, who would find in his words both comfort and challenge. The political situation that had provided the backdrop for his ministry continued its inexorable decline toward the catastrophe he had so long predicted. Kings rose and fell, alliances formed and dissolved, armies marched and retreated. Yet through all these surface changes, the deeper spiritual realities remained unchanged. The people he loved continued in their chosen blindness. The leaders he had counseled persisted in their reliance on human wisdom rather than divine guidance. And the society he had served remained committed to paths that led away from rather than toward their ultimate good. Yet Isaiah no longer viewed these developments with the anguish that had once characterized his response to rejection and resistance. The visions he had been granted, particularly the final revelation of how divine purposes would ultimately triumph over human opposition, had given him a perspective that transcended the immediate frustrations of his prophetic calling. He understood now that his role had never been to change the course of his own generation, but to plant seeds that would bear fruit in seasons he would not live to see, to speak truths that would find their proper audience in times yet to come. The words he had proclaimed over the decades began to take on a life of their own, passed from mouth to mouth by the small remnant who had recognized their divine origin, even when they could not fully comprehend their meaning. These faithful few, scattered throughout the kingdom like seeds on fertile ground, would preserve and transmit the prophetic legacy long after its original spokesman had fallen silent. In their memories and in the scrolls they carefully maintained, Isaiah's voice would continue to speak across centuries, offering guidance to generations facing challenges he had never directly confronted yet somehow perfectly understood. Among those who treasured his words were some who had been present during his most powerful proclamations, who had witnessed the supernatural authority with which he spoke even when his message was rejected by the majority. These individuals carried within their hearts not just the content of his prophecies, but the memory of the presence that had accompanied them, the sense of standing in the vicinity of divine truth being communicated through human lips. Their testimonies would add credibility to written records, providing future generations with confidence that these were not merely the speculations of a gifted individual, but authentic communications from beyond the boundaries of ordinary human knowledge. The influence of Isaiah's ministry extended beyond those who had heard him speak directly to encompass individuals whose hearts had been prepared by suffering to receive truths they might have rejected in more comfortable circumstances. The very catastrophes he had predicted when they finally came to pass would serve as validation of his prophetic credentials and create openness to his other proclamations that had been dismissed during times of apparent prosperity and security. Crisis has a way of clarifying priorities and stripping away the illusions that make divine warnings seem unnecessary or extreme. In the decades and centuries that followed, as the immediate historical context of Isaiah's ministry receded into the past, his words began to be recognized as containing layers of meaning that extended far beyond their original applications. The immediate warnings about Assyrian invasions and political alliances gave way to deeper insights into the nature of divine justice and mercy, while the specific promises about restoration from exile revealed themselves as part of a much larger pattern of redemption that would unfold across the entire sweep of human history. Scholars and spiritual seekers who came after Isaiah would find in his writings a richness that seemed inexhaustible, as if each generation could discover new facets of truth that spoke directly to their own circumstances and challenges. The passages about the suffering servant, which had seemed obscure or even contradictory to his contemporaries, would eventually be recognized as containing the most detailed prophetic description of redemptive sacrifice ever committed to writing. The visions of future glory that had offered comfort to the faithful remnant would inspire hope in countless individuals facing their own seasons of darkness and despair. Perhaps most remarkably, Isaiah's words would prove to possess a quality of universality that transcended the particular religious and cultural context in which they were originally spoken. While rooted in the specific history and traditions of ancient Israel, they would speak with compelling relevance to people of vastly different backgrounds and circumstances, offering insights into the human condition that seemed to bypass the usual barriers of time and culture. This universal appeal would contribute to their preservation and transmission as each generation found reasons to value and protect these ancient proclamations. The vision of divine holiness that had initiated Isaiah's calling would continue to challenge and transform individuals across the centuries, confronting them with the same fundamental questions about human nature and divine perfection that had overwhelmed the young priest in the temple so many years before. The experience of standing in the presence of absolute purity and recognizing one's own corruption, followed by the miracle of cleansing and commissioning, would be repeated in countless lives as people encountered through Isaiah's words the same divine reality that had originally spoken to him. The impossible mission that had defined his ministry would become a source of encouragement to others called to speak difficult truths in resistant environments, to serve faithfully despite apparent lack of results, to trust in divine purposes that operated on timescales longer than human careers or lifetimes. The example of prophetic perseverance that Isaiah provided would inspire missionaries and reformers, activists and artists, all those who felt called to work for transformation that might not be visible in their own generation. Even the resistance he had faced would prove instructive to future generations, offering insight into the predictable patterns of human response to divine truth, the mechanisms by which people protect themselves from messages that challenge their comfortable assumptions, the ways in which religious and political authorities collaborate to suppress inconvenient voices, the psychological processes that allow individuals to avoid confronting their own spiritual condition. All these dynamics would be recognized in Isaiah's experience by those facing similar challenges in their own contexts. The promise of a remnant that had sustained Isaiah through his darkest hours would continue to offer hope to those who found themselves in minority positions, speaking truth to cultures that preferred illusion, maintaining faith in times of widespread apostasy. The assurance that divine purposes could not be ultimately thwarted by human resistance would encourage persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable opposition. Confidence that faithful service would ultimately be vindicated, even if vindication was delayed beyond the servant's lifetime. As the centuries passed and the world changed in ways Isaiah could never have imagined, his words would prove remarkably adaptable to new circumstances while retaining their essential power and relevance. The specific historical references that had anchored his prophecies in his own time would fade in importance, while the deeper spiritual and moral insights gained prominence, allowing his message to speak to technological ages and global civilizations that bore little resemblance to the agricultural society of ancient Judah. The comfort he had offered to those facing exile and displacement would resonate with refugees and immigrants across the ages, while his warnings about the consequences of injustice would challenge societies struggling with inequality and oppression. His visions of ultimate restoration and peace would inspire those working for reconciliation and healing, while his unflinching diagnosis of human spiritual condition would provide essential grounding for all efforts at genuine transformation. In this way, the legacy of Isaiah would extend far beyond the preservation of his specific words to encompass the ongoing influence of the truths he had embodied and proclaimed. His life had demonstrated that faithfulness to divine calling was its own reward, that speaking truth was worthwhile regardless of immediate reception, that serving purposes larger than oneself could provide meaning and satisfaction that no amount of worldly success could match. These lessons, embedded in the story of his ministry and validated by the ultimate fulfillment of his prophecies, would continue to shape lives and guide decisions long after the historical details of his era had been forgotten. The young man who had once stood in the temple courtyard wrestling with questions about meaning and purpose had become, through his willingness to accept an impossible mission, a source of meaning and purpose for countless others. His journey from doubt to faith, from confusion to clarity, from resistance to acceptance, mirrored the spiritual pilgrimage that every generation must undertake in its own way, facing its own challenges, discovering its own calling, learning its own lessons about the cost and reward of faithful service. Isaiah's story reminds us that the most profound transformations often begin in the most ordinary circumstances, that divine purposes frequently work through seemingly insignificant individuals, that the greatest impacts may not be visible until long after the initial investment of faith and effort. In a world that often judges success by immediate and measurable results, his example offers a different standard of evaluation, one that takes into account the eternal as well as the temporal, the spiritual as well as the material, the invisible as well as the visible. If this ancient story has stirred something within you, if you found yourself recognizing your own struggles in Isaiah's journey, or if you've been challenged by the example of his unwavering faithfulness in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances, then perhaps it's time to consider what calling might be waiting for your own response. Like the young priest standing in that temple courtyard so many centuries ago, you may find that the questions you're wrestling with and the longings you're experiencing are actually invitations to step into purposes larger than you've yet imagined. If this exploration of faith, courage, and divine calling has resonated with you, I invite you to like this video and subscribe for more stories that bridge the ancient and modern worlds.